World War One is particularly grueling and ghastly because so many advanced modern weapons were introduced at this time. So, to this point in world history, the American Civil War had been the bloodiest war in in history, the ghastliest, because that was where you had primitive cannons. That's also where you had um, Gatling guns with a little bit more of a rapid fire type aspect. Now, advanced 50 years beyond that, you have all kinds of advanced weaponry, including mobilized tanks, chemical weapons, machine guns, belt fed, by the way, and then you also had aerial bombardments. Okay? There's all kinds of new technology. Now, you have trenches that many of these armies had built, much because of modern weaponry. The old European style of lining up your troops and shooting at your enemy, and then they line up and shoot back at you, that was done. The advancement of weaponry could completely decimate an army in a matter of seconds. So you'd have to build the trench so as not to immediately die. Okay? So you have machine guns and high powered artillery that were born from this era that could truly decimate an entire force. You build the trench, you kind of slow things down. However, because of tanks and flamethrowers that are now introduced into warfare, even trench warfare doesn't stop the carnage. So, you have a mechanized tank, you can roll right over into a trench and you can unleash the flamethrower onto your enemy. So now you have a pack with its fuel, light it, and boom, flaming your enemy out. You literally burn them out of their trench. If that didn't work, there were new forms of gases that would be released: mustard gas, nerve gas, sarin gas, tear gas, all those different types of things. World War One was the first war in world history that introduced chemical warfare. And chemical warfare is just it's disgusting. That's why much of it has been outlawed by the Geneva Convention. The effects of chemical warfare are heinous and hideous. Modern day American servicemen and women must undergo the gas chamber is part of their basic training or boot camp if they're in the Marines. They'll go into the chamber for about 5 to 10 minutes, first with a gas mask on, and then while they're still in there, they have to take it off and endure the gas. It'll make your eyes virtually bleed, your nose just, ugh. It's an awful experience. But the reality why they do that is largely because of World War One. You have to understand the reality of gas at that time and all of these toxins. And tear gas is awful, but it's temporary. Nerve gas, sarin gas, mustard gas are not temporary. They're extremely ghastly. Okay? Then you add in the technology of airplanes. So the Wright brothers had flown the first airplane at Kitty Hawk about 10 years beforehand, roughly or so. Now, 10 years later, you have biplanes that weren't very maneuverable, but there wasn't a whole lot that could bring them down at this point. There wasn't surface-to-air missiles that would come about later on or anything else like that. So you could have these biplanes that could fly overhead and literally drop bombs over the side of the plane and right onto your enemy. Grab your sack of bombs and drop them, and boom, there they go, right on top of your enemy. That was one way to do it. But it also, in World War One, that was the first conflict where you had air-to-air combat. Your primitive fighter airplanes came around about this time. Nowadays, you have F-35s and F-22s and Sukhoi 57s. You've got all kinds of advanced fifth generation fighter aircraft. Back then, it was a biplane. and you try and shoot down the Red Baron, right? If you've seen Charlie Brown and Snoopy, you know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, though, one of the biggest advancements in military technology was naval technology. Nowadays, you would have naval ships, like we mentioned, submarines. You had destroyers, anti submarine craft. You also had primitive detection and navigation systems as well that could detect some of these other different ships and also navigate more cleanly and more directly. You also had high power weaponry aboard these naval planes that could basically serve as larger scale artillery from the coast. So you have modern technology that produces a staggering amount of resource to help your cause because you have an advanced navy. All of these technological advances served the purpose to help win the war, but they produced staggering amounts of casualties. America's involvement in the war netted about 116,000 dead American soldiers. By the way, only about half of those deaths, that 116,000, only about half were casualties of battle, conflict. The other half came by the way of a flu pandemic. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. You want to talk about coronavirus? Let's talk about Spanish flu first, right? Okay. Otherwise, so 116,000 Americans die as a result of World War I. That's a lot, right? That's nothing compared to others. For example, Russia lost 1.8 million troops as a result of World War I. Germany lost about 2 million. France lost about 1.4 million. The British lost about 1 million. Austria-Hungary about 1.5 million or so. There are also estimated to be roughly about 5 million civilian casualties. 116,000 dead American troops is a lot. But in the scheme of things, that's nothing. That's a drop in the bucket compared to what some of these other countries suffered and endured. That's how large this war was. The Russians lost 1.8 million people, servicemen. Germany lost 2 million. Those are unbelievably big numbers. Those are appalling amounts of casualties that are virtually indescribable. How do you describe something like that? Well, you go back to all the technology that existed, the trench warfare, the gases, the airplanes, the advanced high-speed machine guns and other artillery advancements, mortars. You start to get it a little bit, okay? This was an exceptionally destructive war. The true first technologically modern war that really, really made a difference. Now, how do we pay for all the stuff? How does anybody pay for it? The United States, in the spring of 1917 said, okay, we're going to enter into the war. We're going to send troops over. How do you pay for all the stuff that goes over there? Well, you have to basically go into debt at first because that's what the United States government did. We spent roughly about $32 billion on our World War I effort. That's $32 billion in 1918 money. $32 billion is an awfully huge amount of money in 2020. Imagine over 100 years ago what that was like. It's incredible. The United States didn't collect that kind of money from its population to be able to get it. So several different things had to happen. The United States government issued various different bonds to borrow money from Americans and promise to pay back with a little bit extra so as to pay for the war effort. So you could, in theory, take out a war bond to help pay for the effort. And in doing so, you would also instill a very bit of patriotism as well. You are paying for a bond that is going to help our boys overseas win the war. Okay? So, war bonds produced about $23 billion in income. And then other profits came by the way of corporate taxes and other things along those lines that helped pay for the war as well. But it was really those war bonds and taxes upon those with large inheritances that really paid for the war. And it begged a bigger question. What do we do about taxes as well? Are we going to increase our national federal income tax? How involved would the federal government be in an income tax? All those questions would become arise. What is the proper rate for taxation? Okay, those questions would come about, especially as Woodrow Wilson saw the federal income tax being levied upon American citizens. Okay, so those are several different things that would go on there. Now, as with any war effort, the government had a stake in ensuring that there would be public support for the war. There were a surprising number of people who were against this war. And largely, you had socialists and those in the Socialist Party and various other different workers' unions who were heavily against it. But the American government set forth a campaign of wartime propaganda that villainized Germans and the German military and the type of savagery that they are capable of, if that makes sense. And there were some people in the country that openly dissented against the war. They were anti-war for various different reasons. Nowadays, in America's involvement in Iraq, public sentiment was very divided. At first, it was 2-1 basically in favor of going in. But there were some staunch protests against our involvement and our escalation in Iraq. Well, if you're anti-war and you're against us going into Iraq, more power to you. Let your voice be heard. That's the right thing to say if that's what's on your conscience. Back in World War I, the federal government openly suppressed dissent. If you dissented against our war, you'd be guilty of perhaps being accused of not just pessimism, but being disloyal or treasonous. The government actually encouraged you to report any acts of disloyalty or pessimism about our war effort. You could be accused of spying. The Espionage and Sedition Acts were meant to suppress and make illegal any sort of opposition to the war. Think about this. Back in 2003, if you protested against America's invasion of Iraq, okay, you're celebrating your constitutional right to freedom of speech. You're against the war. World War I, that was deemed as treasonous, and you are not to do that. So the Espionage and Sabotage Act and Sedition Acts were meant to suppress any expression of public opposition to the war. Think about that. Kind of like the Sedition Acts back in the constitutional era, where the Federalists promoted the Sedition Acts to basically shout down and suppress Republicans. Similar thing. Sedition Acts to keep people from speaking out against our war effort. That's highly unconstitutional. Okay? There were some who protested so vehemently against it that would ultimately defect from the United States. Those with socialist or even communist sympathies were particularly those who might leave. Otherwise, though, while the government was busy trying to suppress dissent, there were various different campaigns by state and local governments and other people among the population to repress and even harass German Americans. So, even though most German Americans supported America's war effort, they were deemed as being the enemy by many in American society. They were untrustworthy. And there were often times where American citizens would openly suppress German Americans, refuse to have their music played, refuse to have German foods. Any references to the German language was dropped from schoolwork. Oftentimes, Germans were fired from their jobs just because they were German Americans and not trusted. So it was deemed that German Americans could very well sabotage the war effort because they sided with the fatherland and not America. That was the fear. So German Americans faced a significant amount of anti-German dissent in World War I, and they faced a lot of backlash.